Today's poem is one of the Emily Dickinson. So, if we're going to take a step back from the entire canon of Emily, if there's another thing, if there's one place to start with knowing, look, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is not fun. This is heavy. This is not a great feel good, but you're not going to find this in any Hallmark cards. Okay, this is not a Taylor Swift song. Here's what I measure every grief I meet is like. If you were ever in the position where you are Netflixing to chill and you're cuddled up with certain someone about to get some romance on, about to um, anyway, if you were ever in position to Netflix to chill and you turn on the Netflix box and you stumble across all the movies and whoever you're with goes, "Oh, hey, Schindler's List." Stop sleeping with that person. Don't do it again. That's not You've seen it once. You watched the movie. That's enough. You did your homework. You don't want to redo that homework. You don't want to go back through The Girl with the Red Coat. You don't want to have to go back over everything that's in that movie. You did it once. You were on that ride. It's done. You've been there, right? This poem, in many ways, is like that movie. If you're willing to take poetry seriously, if there is some portion of you that is susceptible to poetry, and look, poetry is difficult. So music, a song comes on the radio that moves you, you have no choice. It's there. It's immediate. It is very, very now. Movies, movies like Schindler's List are a lot the same way. You don't really get a choice so long as it's in front of you. You notice this because people tear up at movies. You didn't go through anything, you stooge, but it's making you cry. You didn't know the character that was lost, but you feel some emotional tug. That person's on a screen, right? That person is not you. That person is not anyone you've ever known or met. Poetry, poetry's even more difficult than that. It's another step removed, but in that way, so long as you are willing to make yourself susceptible to the poem, it becomes deeper than that. There are lines in this poem. I measure every grief I meet with narrow, probing eyes. Suddenly, this is not on a television screen. This is not projected onto a movie screen in front of you. You have to do the work to read the words, translate them in your mind into images. And what are the odds that when you see that grieving face, it is someone that you know? Which makes this all that much more hard hitting. The final intro note that I have for this poem is very much along those lines. The final intro note that I have for this poem, if you have been in this Echoes of Emily series playlist here on the channel for any amount of videos, I end these videos, and this is several times now that this portion of the video has made it into the intro because it's so interesting to me. I end these videos with a compilation. So what I do is I do an intro, a reading, analysis, and then a reading with interpretive visuals from ChatGPT's DALL-E. I entered this poem into ChatGPT, and it said to me, "Whoa, can't do it, boss. Not in those words." But that's what it said. Can't do it. You can feed that poem into the system all you want, buddy. I'm not giving you pictures based on this poem. There's one line, a couplet, I guess I should say, that I think this couplet is the troubling one. Would you care to live, or would you just choose not to? That is probably the problematic line. But again, in that, ChatGPT has to do the figuring as to what that means before it tells you, nope, can't do it, boss. The heft, therefore, of this poem is such that artificial intelligence, not artificial emotionality, not emotional intelligence, artificial intelligence looks at this collection of words and says, hey man, are you sure you want to be here right now? Artificial intelligence looks at I measure every grief I meet with 0 mentions of violence, with 0 mentions of putting anyone down. Artificial intelligence looks at I measure every grief I meet with 0 mentions even of death. Not explicitly. Artificial intelligence looks at this poem and says, what? What are you doing here? Go back. Go back. So, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this poem is in this playlist, is in this collection, is in this series, but I think that it's important. This video is part of 3 separate playlists here on the channel. Number 1 being obviously the Echoes of Emily playlist, but number 2 being a playlist of Emily Dickinson poetry discussions, and third, the general playlist for poetry discussions. If you like or appreciate the work that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing that I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every single week. So consider hitting the subscribe button to stick around for more literature in the future. I measure every grief I meet with narrow, probing eyes. I wonder if it weighs like mine, or has an easier size. I wonder if they bore it long, or did it just begin? I could not tell the date of mine. It feels so old a pain. I wonder if it hurts to live, and if they have to try, and whether, could they choose between, it would not be to die. I note that some, gone patient long, at length renew their smile, an imitation of a light that has so little oil. I wonder if, when years have piled some thousands on the harm that hurt them early, such a lapse could give them any balm. Or would they go on aching still through centuries of nerve, enlightened to a larger pain, in contrast with the love? The grieved are many, I am told. There is the various cause. Death is but one, and comes but once, and only nails the eyes. There's grief of want, and grief of cold, a sort they call despair. There's banishment from native eyes, in sight of native air. And though I may not guess the kind correctly, yet to me, a piercing comfort it affords in passing Calvary, to note the fashions of the cross and how they're mostly worn. Still fascinated to presume that some are like my own. So let's go through this poem a little bit, and then I have some talking points for it. I measure every grief I meet with narrow, probing eyes. I wonder if it weighs like mine or has an easier size. A little bit, maybe, of flowery language, but we know exactly what this is. Our speaker here is talking about how she will look in everyone's eyes to see how sad they are. Are they as sad as she is? Which is a part of the conceit here is that everyone has grief. I wonder if they bore it long or did it just begin. I could not tell the date of mine, it feels so old a pain. This part fairly obvious. This part, the thing worth noting in this couplet here, I could not tell the date of mine, it feels so old a pain, is that what our speaker is letting us know is that the pain that she carries with her, technically I don't know if there is anything that is gendering this poem, but the pain she carries with her is so much a part of her personality. She doesn't know if it ever wasn't there. I wonder if it hurts to live and if they have to try. This sadness that they wake up with, this grief, is it literally painful? Do they have to tell themselves, got to get out of bed today? And whether, could they choose between, it would not be to die? Would they rather just not wake up in the morning? I note that some, gone patient long, at length renew their smile, an imitation of a light that has so little oil. Some people retrain themselves to at least look happy, to at least look as if they are not grieving all the time. I wonder if, when years have piled some thousands on the harm that hurt them early, such a lapse could give them any balm. Basically, this is saying, is there any reprieve? Is there any reprieve from your grief, despite the fact that life will keep piling other griefs on top? Or would they go on aching still through centuries of nerve, enlightened to a larger pain in contrast with the love? Not sure if I can explicate that anymore, except to say that this is just saying that the pain of life, these three lines here, probably outweigh even love, even the power of love. The grieved are many, I am told. There is various cause. Death is but one and comes but once and only nails the eyes. The grieved are many, I am told. This is interesting because it's almost contrasting with the earlier part of the poem, where our speaker is telling us that I measure every grief I meet with narrow probing eyes, almost suggesting that everyone she meets, they are the grieved. Death is but one and comes but once and only nails the eyes. There are many griefs to be had. The death in question here is the personal death. We're not talking about the death of a loved one, because this death comes but once and only nails the eyes. Maybe sounds like a bit of a strange phrase until we get down here of the cross, right? We're talking about Jesus a little bit. We're talking about, well, when I say Jesus there, what I'm talking about, the poem talking about, the speaker talking about, is more or less the idea of that sacrifice, being the sacrifice. And so the only nails the eyes. Those stigmata Christ had through the palms, Christ had through the ankles or the feet, or the palm or the wrist, depends on where you want to believe these things happened, or the crown of thorns, the lesser known of the stigmata, the lesser appreciated perhaps of the stigmata, the lesser occurring perhaps of the stigmata. These things are other torturous affairs. But these nails being driven only through the eyes means that it just ends the one suffering, right? The having nails through the hands, through the wrists, this is more extreme, perhaps, than the finality of death. There is more suffering to be had there. There's grief of want and grief of cold, a sort they call despair. There's banishment from native eyes and sight of native air. Just going through some of the other types of suffering, but we will get back to this here. And though I may not guess the kind correctly, yet to me a piercing comfort it affords in passing Calvary. This is saying that, look, I'm gonna guess when they walk past, and though I might be wrong, they are still on the same army as me. To note the fashions of the cross and how they're mostly worn, still fascinated to presume that some are like my own. Maybe the interesting thing to talk about here is this word, presume. Our speaker is suffering in silence. Our speaker, this may be the narrow, probing eyes that she gives everyone, but she never whispers that word to them. She never asks them anything about their grief. It's just measuring with narrow, probing eyes. So, I didn't finish the ChatGPT story. I realized that after I was getting that into the editing bit here. The images that you will see are, so this is maybe sort of a pro tip towards DALL-E. The images you're going to see are images mostly that I had concocted and described to ChatGPT based on the poem itself. Little experiments that I tried to do through just describing something based on the poem. However, if you were ever in this same predicament, one thing that ChatGPT will do is inspiration. So normally I just copy and paste the poem directly into DALL-E and see what happens, and sometimes there are wild things. But what I ended up doing with some of them is saying, give me a widescreen ratio picture based on an interpretation of I Measure Every Grief I Meet by Emily Dickinson. Then it gave me some pretty good stuff, but it would not just take the poem. It's an interesting thing. It is almost it's almost as if you're playing on the subconscious of artificial intelligence, which is something I never pictured myself saying. So when something is your thing, look, this conceit at the beginning, I measure every grief I meet with narrow probing eyes. I wonder if it weighs like mine or has an easier size. What are we doing here? When I was younger, I was the buff guy. I mean, buff. I was the buff guy, and I could bench press 340 for reps. I was doing crazy weights on hang cleans and not crazy weights on squats, but doing still. Not a lot of people even do squats and deadlifts, very heavy deadlifts. And I would just subconsciously, you don't even know you're doing it. You've got the thing. You've got your thing. That is what you do. You are the buff guy. You walk into a room and you don't even know you're doing it, but you look around. Oh, I can bench more than him. That guy's a terror on the deadlifts, but I bet I could get him. You know, you just constantly size people up. And part of this sort of with physicality, is almost related to this poem in that it becomes, hey, if that guy gets to be a problem, I got it taken care of. If this guy over here, if that guy gets to be a problem, I need a strategy. And it's something I think a lot of people do, just sort of psychologically all the time. It's kind of it's a background program running on your hardware, but what our speaker here is doing is the very same thing, which suggests magnificently, subliminally suggests is that this is our speaker's thing. Grief is what our speaker does. Grief, it's what's for dinner. Our speaker loves grieving. Our speaker only knows grieving. The same way that the buff guy walks into the room and knows who he could outbench, our griever here is walking into the room and peeping out different sadnesses. What a wild thing to think. What a wild conceit to have. What a wild way to go about one's life. Nihilism, the limiting factor. I put the limiting factor here. Why did I put the limiting factor? So nihilism for me will often come back to strong nihilism. Strong nihilism being, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to question every assumption that everyone makes for me. What I am going to do as a nihilist is call out all of society. And if that part of society can explain itself, or if I can stop believing in something and realize at some point that belief helped, if I can stop doing a thing and then realize, oh, yeah, I do have to do that thing. One of the things, it's interesting, Elon Musk has said that, he said when he first bought Twitter, we're going to cut a lot of people. And if we don't end up adding some of them back, it means we didn't cut enough, right? That's nihilism. You want to cut everything, and if it turns out you need some of it, you just add it back. But what I will say is that for this poem, grief breaks people, doesn't it? What our speaker is doing here, in these constant measurings up, is saying, well, there's mystery to it because she does not actually know the grief, but she knows grief in general. Looking at these people and saying, oh, that grief did not break this individual. That individual withstood the blow. That individual took the test of grief and kept on trucking, baby. That is an interesting observation, especially from a nihilistic standpoint. This poem is not the most nihilistic of Emily Dickinson poems, but it has that principle behind it, what I think to be a nihilistic principle. Now, I said I would work in nihilism and hauntology in every video if I could, and I think I will. Where are we at here? For hauntology. Hauntology deals with the future being canceled. The future being canceled leaves people with a certain type of dread, an interesting type of dread, an emotion set, if I can say it that way, an emotion set that is foreboding in nature. There's grief of want and grief of cold, a sort they call despair. There's banishment from native eyes in sight of native air. Despair. I grabbed this definition from Google, so I have no idea who to attribute it to. Despair is the feeling of not having any hope left. If you have completely forgot to study your final exam in math, you might feel despair when your teacher passes out the test. Despair can also refer to someone or something that causes you to worry or be sad. Despair is the feeling of not having any hope left. What is hope? Not the thing with feathers. That's not what I mean. Hope is saying that the future will be better. That's what hope is. I mean, in essence, hope is saying, in worst case scenario, there is a future. Our speaker here is saying, There's a lot of griefs out there, and one of those griefs is despair. Despair is the loss of hope. The loss of hope is the loss of future. Our speaker here is saying one of the types of grief that there is basically known as hauntology. It is a weird, perhaps circuitous way to work hauntology back in, but I think it stands. I measure every grief I meet with narrow, probing eyes. I wonder if it weighs like mine, or has an easier size. I wonder if they bore it long, or did it just begin? I could not tell the date of mine. It feels so old a pain. I wonder if it hurts to live, and if they have to try, and whether, could they choose between, it would not be to die. I note that some, gone patient long, at length renew their smile, an imitation of a light that has so little oil. I wonder if, when years have piled some thousands on the harm that hurt them early, such a lapse could give them any balm, or would they go on aching still through centuries of nerve, enlightened to a larger pain, in contrast with the love? The grieved are many, I am told. There is the various cause. Death is but one, and comes but once, and only nails the eyes. There's grief of want, and grief of cold, a sort they call despair. There's banishment from native eyes, in sight of native air. And though I may not guess the kind correctly, yet to me, a piercing comfort it affords in passing Calvary, to note the fashions of the cross and how they're mostly worn, still fascinated to presume that some are like my own.